You want to put ATF on it?
Because
hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris. This is Restoration Rescue. We have a special guest with us today as we're going to throw the pistons in this block. All right guys, we're back here with Sergeant Miki. He was on a previous video when he helped grind off some of the hard edges of our motor, but the motor's back and he's going to be helping us today putting in these pistons. So what's the first thing that we need to do?
So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the engine ready. So we're going to clean up some of the spots with some surface rust to it, and then we're going to start working on piston rings. And then from there we'll assemble, and then we'll start putting everything together.
All right. So when it has the rust, what's the main thing that we're trying to get rid of? Can we have a little bit of rust, or do we need all the rust gone whatsoever?
So a little bit of rust isn't an issue, because even when your car sits outside, when you don't let it run, same thing like your brake rotors, you get a little bit of surface rust because there's moisture in the air and we can never get rid of all of it. So we're going to use a little bit of ATF. It's something I've always used when I'm putting the engines together, because it kind of helps. One, it's a detergent. Two, it's a lubricant, and it'll help set the piston rings. It kind of soaks it and causes them to swell, so it makes that first fire a little bit easy. It's going to smoke a little bit first time you fire it, but it's going to fire a little bit easier.
Okay, and then with the ATF, what would make it cause the rings to swell?
It's just so it's a hydraulic fluid, and the rings have like a carbon basic coating on the outside of it, and when that ATF soaks into it, it just kind of causes it to swell and expand. It's just a little chemical reaction it has to it, and it's also, like I said, a detergent, so it's going to help coat and seal these walls and kind of help protect it from the rust and keep everything from binding and sticking through the whole assembly process until we actually get the starter on it and start turning it over to fire the first time.
All right, well, let's start knocking some of this stuff out and hopefully get some pistons in today. All right, guys, so that's gonna take care of cleaning. We're gonna have Sergeant Miki here explain why we did it so that we can get ready to put this motor together.
So basically all we did is we wiped down the inside of each cylinder, because we want to make sure that any large debris or even any small debris doesn't stick to the inside of the cylinder walls, because it'll cause more scratches and mess up that beautiful cross hatch that the machine has put in there. So as you saw in the video, you don't want to do the little flip trick with getting fluid on, because you can get contaminants off your rag and your bottle. So kind of hold it and pour. And next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start getting these rings gapped to get them measured for each cylinder.
All right, so what are we really gonna do with these rings? Do they have to go in a specific spot, or which way do we have to do it to make sure that we do this right?
So I always recommend reading the instructions. I know it's not the best thing in the world, but they have QR codes so you can watch a video on it. But each cylinder has a number on it, and it tells you on each pack inside of there, it'll tell you where the ring goes. And it's kind of important to make sure that you get the ring in there and squared up and measured. So cylinder one, we're going to measure the specs for each cylinder, cylinder one. And as we do it, we're going to take it straight from here. When we take it out of the cylinder, after we have to do any adjustments, we're going to set it on that piston, put it back in the box, and we're going to move on to do number 3, 5, 7. Then we'll move over to the other side of the bank and we'll do 2, 4, 6, 8, all the same way, and get all the pistons set. And then once we get them all set, we can put this stuff away, clear up our workspace, and we can go on to moving on to the next step.
Okay, so just to make sure, each piston, we have to do it for each one,
Yes.
just to make sure? Okay. All right, guys, so like you said, we're gonna start setting this up and we're gonna knock this out. All right, guys, so that is it with the rings. We have gotten them all in each bore. We've taken each of the set of 3. As you can see, there's 2 of the oil scraper rings and the regular ring. We put it in. We used the piston and made sure that when they went in that they were flat, and then used this, which is a feeler gauge, or this calls itself a thickness gauge. And we made sure when we put it in that we had the right amount of clearance. So after that, what we're gonna do is we pulled them all out and put them, and they each go with a specific one. So right now, Sergeant Miki is gonna give us a little bit better of an explanation of what we did, and then we're gonna go and put the rings on the pistons.
All right, so we measured each ring. We measured the first ring, which the first ring and second ring are your compression rings. And when we set them in, we're gonna clock them 180 degrees out. So one ring gap is gonna face this side of the wrist pin. The second ring gap is gonna face this side of the wrist pin. The gap is crucial on these 2 because, as I said, this is where your compression comes from. Now, your oil scraper ring consists of 3 parts. You have the ring, then you have a little flat scraper here, and then you have a top scraper to it. Creates a little sandwich. Okay, this has a lot of tolerance inside of it, and it moves around a lot inside of the cylinder. As it runs, these are gonna spin, they're gonna rotate, they're gonna do all sorts of things inside the motor, but all this is going to do is it's gonna scrape the oil back down into the bottom of the oil pan. So tolerance on these have a lot more play than tolerance on your top rings. So you can pull up the spec for these. There is a spec for them, but it's not, again, as I said, it's not as crucial for the spec and tolerance on these rings as it is for the top 2 for your compression. Now what we're gonna do is, my personal preference is I like to assemble the piston bottom to top. So we set the oil scraper ring in first, the corrugated looking ring. Then we're gonna set the lower scraper ring on, the upper scraper ring. Then we're gonna put on the first compression ring and the second compression ring.
So when we do this, is there, obviously we're gonna put all the rings on, but is there a specific way it has to be done to go with each piston, or does it matter at that point, like when we put it on the piston?
So when we do each piston, we're gonna put it together, and then, like I said, we're gonna put them back in the box, and we're gonna keep them all oriented in the right way. But the hard part comes when we go to put them inside. When we actually go to set the piston, is making sure, as it's marked, you have front of piston and the back of the piston. Make sure the front of the piston's facing the timing cover, because everything's set up. Front of the motor is the timing cover. And then we have some more stuff we'll go over with protecting the crank as we set the pistons in when we get to that point.
All right, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna start putting these rings on these pistons, and let's knock this out. All right, guys, so as you can see in the montage that we just showed you is that we've got everything in. All the rings are set. As you can see, we have the oil scraper ring, the oil ring, another oil scraper ring, and 2 compression rings. On this one, I know Sergeant Miki pointed it out in that montage, there's a dot which tells you the top. He told me on this one, and thank God he did, because I probably would have put it upside down. There is like a little rolled edge that's gonna be the top part. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna start shooting these pistons in this block. So Sergeant Miki, what do we need to do to get prepared to do this?
All right, so you can go online and they make these specialty tools that it's a silicone sleeve that goes over the studs. But honestly, it's a bit pricey just to buy one of those. So what we did is we took some old fuel line, and after we take the cap off, you're gonna take this old fuel line, you're gonna slide it over that stud. And the reason you wanna do that is because this is a hard metal for the studs on the pistons. This will mar that crank and destroy that bearing mating surface if it hits it the wrong way. So to protect it and save all that money you spent getting a polished crank, and if you're building a performance motor, that crank costs a lot of money. So we're gonna use these little sleeves here, we're gonna put them over top of the studs as we drive the piston in. Once the piston is in, then we're gonna put the bearings in. You don't wanna put the bearings on the piston before you drive it in, because as you tap that piston, you're gonna shake the bearing out, and then you've got a bearing that hit the ground, it's all scratched up, and take the chance of damaging the bearing before you even put it in the motor. So what we're gonna do, like I said, we're gonna cover these, we're gonna drive them in one at a time, and then we'll work our way through, rinse and repeat all the way down the motor.
So just to make sure before we do this, we're gonna put the assembly lube on these too, right? Just
Yes.
like we did on the crank, okay.
We're gonna put assembly lube on top of the bearings, between the bearing mating surface and the crank, where it's gonna rotate. But like you have on the crank journals, you have that same little little lip to retain the bearings in here, so it's not gonna spin in here. The bearing spinning surface is gonna be between the crank and the crank journal and the piston housing.
And before you set them, you want to explain the 180 for them?
Okay, yeah. So each piston ring is 180 degrees out for the gap on the two compression rings. So there's the lower ring is set to the side of the wrist pin, and then the upper ring is set to the side here. Each piston's marked with a front, and then you have a back. So the front of the motor, as we said before, the front of the motor is a timing cover. And on Chevrolet motors, all your odd number pistons are gonna be on the driver's side bank. All the even pistons are gonna be on the passenger side bank. And the bank is the row of cylinders for the V.
So let's go ahead and we're gonna knock this out. We're gonna get all of them set in and hopefully start wrenching down on them on the bottom and get this thing wrapped up.
You want to put ATF on it?
Because it cleans it.
All right, guys, so what you saw that what we just did is we knocked in our pistons like Sergeant Miki had said. He put the little piece of rubber on the bottom of that so to get it down nice and straight. We used a ring compressor. You put it around, and obviously you saw it, well, without having it ratchet wide open, sorry about that. And you just take the end of a mallet and you knock it down. And then that's where we turned it over to Sergeant Miki, and he's gonna tell us what he did down at the bottom.
And so once we got it, the piston in the hole and got all the rings past the threshold of the cylinder wall, we went underneath and we cleaned off the crank journal and we cleaned off the mating surface for the back of the piston or the back of the connecting rods. After we cleaned that off, then we put a little bit of assembly lube on the inside of the bearings, set the top of the piston and push it down closer to the crank, set the top bearing in, then set the piston home. Put it completely around that top journal. Then we cleaned the connecting rod cap, did the same thing on the other side, put the bearing in it, sandwiched it up to the bottom. He held the top of the piston, I gave the bottom of the cap a little bit of a tap to set it, put the nuts on just finger tight, and we're only doing it finger tight so we can easily turn this crank over as we go all the way down the end. Once we get all 8 in, like I said, we're gonna flip it over, torque it all down to spec.
Like he said, it's all just like what he said before, rinse and repeat. We're gonna do it for all 8. Then what we have to do is you spin it over and you torque it down from there. We aren't gonna show you the rest of this part, but torquing, we showed you in the last video, is pretty easy, just same thing. For us, it's 40 to 45 degrees because of the size of the nut. If you have a smaller nut, obviously smaller. Make sure you check your specs. But that's gonna wrap it up for today's video. Thanks for stopping by, guys. We appreciate it. Make sure you follow Sergeant Miki on Instagram. He is starting a brand new YouTube channel and it's coming out in the next couple weeks. So make sure you're subscribed to him there. So make sure you're subscribed to us. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you next Saturday.